the blue. I'm dealing with things that are bigger than me and you. Well, I'm already running from you. Out of the blue, I'm dealing with things that are bigger than me and you. Yeah. I can't help myself. You know it's true.
Hello, everyone. Greg Staley here from Diverge Media. We're very excited to have our next guest join us. Dan McTeague is an 18-year veteran of the House of Commons and is widely known in both official languages for his tireless work on energy pricing and saving Canadians through accurate price forecasts. His work for Canadians for Affordable Energy has him widely sought out for his extensive knowledge in energy pricing, and he has continued to provide valuable insights to North American media and policymakers outside of his time in Parliament. Thank you, everybody. Let's welcome our guest, Dan McTeague of Canadians for Affordable Energy. How are you tonight, Dan?
Good to be here, and thank you for such a great introduction. I must say I'm blushing, but glad to talk about issues that are important to people.
Absolutely. So one of the ones that's been sleeping on people is this Line 5 issue. So we're going to jump right into that. But basically, there's been a push in recent years by conservatives, liberal governments, and then the like, to invest in green tech like wind and solar, while simultaneously raising the cost on affordable forms of energy like gas through carbon pricing schemes. So just off the gate, why do we think every party seems to be moving towards this general direction of heavy investments in, I'll say green infrastructure with an air quote, and I'll let you take it from there.
Well, I think it has a lot to do with perhaps the momentum, perhaps it's the fad, perhaps it's a little bit of education as far as the agenda that's being pushed, that the most important thing we have out there is our planet, which we all agree with. None of us want to pollute, but they've actually forced us to look at only one aspect of what they determine to be pollution, which ironically is part of photosynthesis, part of the giver of life. That's carbon. It's an inert gas. And we have now really demonized that particular molecule to the extent that we now see it as an existential threat to our future. And for that reason, not just governments, but opinion leaders seem to be universal in their condemnation of carbon and willing to put policies in place without giving any second thought. Whether or not it is having an effect on temperatures and variations in temperatures has not been established in science. And so while they talk about going back to science and, that they trust the science on this, and there's no law of climate, there's certainly no law that demonstrates the connectivity between the two. That's not to say we can't do better. The reality, Greg, is that here in Canada, we have done better. Yeah. I was a member of Parliament of a riding that had nuclear reactors, the first commercial reactors in North America. We're not, the idea of clean energy is not new. Your province as well, with the hydro projects in Labrador. My province adopting the first Tesla technology for hydro in Ontario over a century ago. To me, I think we have to be a little bit more understanding of the priorities of Canadians. And I think right now we've seen just one issue really predominate in the minds of the elite, call them that, people I've worked with, bureaucrats, media, politicians. There seems to be only one flavor of the day. And unfortunately, they're discounting not only scientific fact, they're now discounting consumers. And that's where I come in, because I spent and cut my teeth, as you quite rightly pointed out, many years as a consumer advocate, but also to ensure that my party, the Liberal Party, actually took a balanced approach. We need to look at the things that make our country do very well economically, and we don't want to sacrifice that, because if you lose people and you destroy their ability to make ends meet, you won't have many people joining the green bandwagon. A lot of people start jumping off.
And that's one of the things in your net zero article I was just reading. You say there's many questions that come to mind when discussing the idea of net zero by 2050, but it's really hard to get answers to these questions. You say more often than not, what you do is some version of the sky is falling, and then politicians and business leaders, environmentalists say things like, we have to act now, time's running out, our future depends on it. And then you say the rhetoric about the environment has been going on like this for decades. But then you say it's a scare tactic, forcing consumers to accept things like Trudeau's carbon taxes, green energy plans, or other policy madness that really means expanding government control, enriching special interests, and hurting consumers. So, sorry, you want to just elaborate on that a little bit more?
But paraphrase that by simply saying that looking at all of the angles, it's pretty clear to me that we have also erected an industry in this country in which foundations, charities, in which donations to universities, to lecturers, always produce these papers and these ideas that somehow carbon being bad, as I mentioned earlier. If you were to, for a moment, to take away the foundation's money, which should be subject to greater scrutiny, I might add, the scrutiny that the Trudeau government took away, or charitable organizations, charities that basically say we're doing charitable work, but in fact are doing PR work 24/7 around the clock. And if you were to take away the subsidies, taxpayer subsidies, not just here for electric vehicles, but subsidies to organizations and for groups like the Canadian Federation of Municipalities, which receives billions of your tax dollars so they can in turn tell the federal government and public that we need to do more on climate. The reality is that this becomes a bit of a self-serving policy. And I think what's happening is that you are now quickly leaving Canadians away. And the most greatest illustration we have right now is that you have a real crisis, a pandemic, a health crisis. And yet you have politicians talking about the so-called green crisis, the what they call the, unbelievably, that we're looking at a climate crisis. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Either they're bored or they're clued out. But either way, it shows a significant detachment from reality. And that reality is about to bite everybody in the pocketbook very quickly. 2 carbon taxes, regulations, and of course, the destruction of many of our manufacturing energy sector industries is making it so that Canada may no longer afford the luxury of being able to pay organizations to come up constantly with this barrage of disinformation about climate and about the need for Canadians to punish themselves for no reason at all.
Well, it definitely feels like it's a punish. That's what it feels like as a consumer. Like I'm lower, I have a family of 3. I have 3 beautiful girls, 1 on the way. And, we're on that low. Thank you. We're on that lower end of the income spectrum. And every time I hear these conversations, it's like, I don't want to pollute either. Everybody is on that side, but I can't afford to add $30, $40 to the cost of filling up my van. Every time I go out, that's money out of my kids' mouths. And so I think there's just like the civilian population wants to do the right thing, but where the government's going with it just seems like it's always on the back of the populace. Whereas maybe private industry is not being stoked to make these things on their own volition. Rather, it always seems to come back to taxes and schemes that hurt the common person. So the big reset,
the government of Canada,
go ahead.
Yeah, but I think you have to look at the context. 53% of Canadians are now saying that they are $200 away from bankruptcy at the end of every month. That's up from 46% last year. We're dealing with an inevitable showdown between the public's ability to make ends meet and government policies. And those government policies, I think, are uniquely defined to hurt people. Even the idea of a carbon tax, and I'm talking about the first one, which isn't completely rebated, and of course starts to hammer people if it happens to be that as we've seen for 2 years in a row in Canada, an average colder winter and an average warmer summer. The reality is that these things will not achieve. And I think it's critical that we ask our politicians one simple question. If you love this stuff, tell me where all this money, all this propaganda, all this idea, tell me how it's going to change the weather. And I know I'm not being facetious. They say that carbon will do that. Well, we see that carbon emissions continue to rise, even though we've had a pandemic. So what does that tell you? It suggests to me that it's wrong-headed. Ask British Columbia, which of course today has had to admit over the past week that despite 2 carbon taxes, a low carbon fuel standard costing 14 cents a liter, no mystery cents, Mr. Horgan, and an existing carbon tax of 9.96, their emissions continue to rise. So it's got to be something else.
Yeah, and it's coming to a head, but I wanted to ask this question. Wouldn't it, we had this conversation a little bit, but Canada produces clean oil. I think that's it's not even a comparison. We are the world leading standard in clean oil. So on that topic, wouldn't it be better for the world if Canada provided heavy polluting nations with our energy? So for instance, why don't we supply our oil and gas to nations like China, who in 2019, according to the Rhodium Group report, polluted more than all developed nations combined? So that's the one thing I get hung up on. I can understand the green, let's go green, but why don't we want to make the income through oil to go for the transition?
Because we made a big mistake in signing on to a trendy accord, the Paris Accord in 2015, that uniquely punishes Canada. Because it says, hey, despite the fact that you've made the transition from coal to natural gas, and you have all these nuclear reactors, and you have hydroelectric power in many of the eastern part of the country and even British Columbia, despite all that, we still want you to go 30% below your 2005 target. And not only that, despite the fact you're the coldest country on the face of this planet, and you need more energy, what they didn't bother ascertaining, and this is where Trudeau simply failed by being sloppy and just trying to make the image and cheer a few glasses of swill back some some Perrier and chew down some canapes. What he failed to do was to ensure that Canada got credit under Article 5 of that particular Paris Accord, that we get credit for the natural gas that we would sell to China or to India to prevent them from building coal plants as an alternative. Make no mistake, China can buy as much natural gas as we can sell it. But we have people in this country blocking pipelines, playing all these stupid games and silly games for which no other country would tolerate. But we are bending over backwards. We have a great human rights track record, but we are doing it to ourselves. And we've signed a very bad agreement. If I were Prime Minister tomorrow, I would tear up the agreement and say, I want Section 5 re-amended so that if we do sell clean energy to other countries, we damn well get credit in terms of the target. I want to be on board, but I'm not also going to be a poltroon. I'm not going to be an international Boy Scout and try to play cute while damaging our economy. And that's exactly what your Prime Minister did. And I hate to say it, with Aaron O'Toole backing that up as well, that's shameful. He should have smartened up and not jumped on board. Unfortunately, I know Aaron, as I may have mentioned to you before, he had asked me to run in 2019 for under Andrew Scheer. I said, absolutely not. I'm not partisan. I'm certainly not going to the Conservative Party. But to me, this is a real failure of understanding what the Paris Accord has done. And I think, unfortunately, parliamentarians who currently sit in the House of Commons are absolutely oblivious to the stupidity that they've actually signed on to.
Do you think it's ignorance, or do you think it's like there's willful arrogance on this? Because it seems like politicians should know better. We have the most valuable resource. We could be one of the richest countries providing ethical, clean energy to the world and doing all these green initiatives at the same time, transition. We could create a green future from like a big reset, Newfoundland budget proposed, but they're not talking about that. They're talking about taxing, getting rid of carbon, and then it feels like they're just forcing through the green transition with no plan. I don't understand the disconnect between that and the people they serve. It just seems like it's a room full of elites, and you're talking at a wall when you try to talk to them about how much this hurts everyone.
Well, it's an extraordinary, powerful lobby with billions, and if not trillions of dollars of investments. And you've got the Greenpeaces, the Sierra Club. You have the Rockefeller Foundation, the same guys who lost the monopoly that they had on oil, working hard to try to get it back. And you have a lot of parliamentarians who simply give up. They're told what to do. Look, Justin Trudeau's caucus are trained SEALs. I know that because, of course, Mr. Trudeau can't stand up to anybody within his own caucus that stands up to him. That's why he has officials from the Prime Minister's office in to do interference with him in the caucus. For anybody who's been a member of any caucus anywhere in this country, it's a relationship that you have. It's a special relationship that you have with the cabinet, with the Prime Minister, and backbenchers, and where there's no holds barred as long as you don't leak what's in there. But now you have a Prime Minister who can't handle these things, and of course has really only one narrative, and has been enjoined by people like Gerald Butts and others who pushed and promoted this devastating policy, this Green Energy Act here in Ontario. Do you realize, Greg, that I just looked at my bill from 2005. I probably have it sitting around here somewhere. The 2005 bill cost me 5 cents a kilowatt hour for my home in 2007. It now costs 17 cents. Now, of course, there's ways of abating that. And the province has incurred a $6.5 billion debt just to shield me, so I'm not paying 25 cents a kilowatt hour. If that's what the public in Ontario thinks is cool And we should triple down, quadruple down on that with carbon taxes and low carbon fuel standards and all sorts of regulations. Then I think we have to be able to say to ourselves as Canadians, forget the politicians. If we're stupid enough to go along with this, and I use that word, then we have only ourselves to blame. When we lose our jobs, we lose our industry. I mean, tomorrow we ban plastics in this country. For goodness sakes, the thing that is the very front line of defense for our healthcare system in this country has been plastics, has been PPEs derived from fossil fuels. And we're saying it's a toxic product. Let's import it rather than, have it developed in Canada. Well, that's fine. You've just taken 50,000 jobs and given it to another country. That's the stupidity of the policies in this country, and Canadians going along with it because they like a prime minister who has, nice hair. They like his sobbing. They like his socks, and they like his selfies. Wake up, Canadians. Wake up.
I think that's a big issue, and I think you nailed it. Canadians are very complacent, and it's almost we let these things happen, and I get what you're saying is we kind of deserve it at this point. So let's transition into the Line 5 topic that people aren't aware about on this complacency issue. So if we could explain to the audience here, Mr. McTeague, the importance of Line 5, how much oil it brings into Ontario and Quebec, gets refined, and what the ramifications would be if Enbridge actually decides to shut that down, or if the court order goes through and they shut it down on the other side.
It would be the death knell of Canada's economy as we know it. Look, don't take my word for it. A week and a half ago, I said, if we lose Line 5, it would be like the United States losing the Colonial Pipeline 4 days before it happened.
And then the hack,
I didn't know the hack was going to happen. Of course, I'm not responsible for it, and I make that declaration right here and now. But Greg, this is perhaps the most this idea that you could somehow wish away pipelines and bend over backwards for every a pressure group that's out there, green, Aboriginal, whatever, all of these things, it's coming real, because if you shut that pipeline down, here's what happens. Ontario loses 50% of all its fuel, all its jet fuel, all its diesel to drive its trucks. Emergency transport would be imperiled. Grocery deliveries would be imperiled. Aviation fuel, propane, and not just propane for your barbecues, because that's the easy one. People laugh and say, oh, I guess I won't be using my propane barbecue this summer if that happens, or whenever. But they don't realize that most warehouses use propane to drive the forklifts, the tow motors. It's considered a very clean energy. What that means is a likelihood of 20 to 50 cent a liter increase in gasoline. 2/3 to 3/4 of all gas stations would shut down in Ontario, and it would be worse for Quebec. Ontario gets 50% of its oil from Line 5, but Quebec gets 66%. So the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And the irony isn't lost on many of us that know that had the Energy East pipeline already been built or on its way, it doesn't really matter what you put in it. You could put heavy oil or light oil. That is a conduit. That's a pipeline that already exists to Ontario. So imagine it'd be 2 to 3 years in this if the Liberals weren't so keen and quick on destroying pipelines. So what does it mean for Canada? It means for consumers in Eastern Canada, real trouble. It means manufacturers, farmers, our transport infrastructure would come to a grinding halt. There are no other alternatives. For producers out west, they're stuck with 400,000 barrels to 540,000 barrels that they can't move. They might be able to repurpose some of that, but it would mean, of course, revenues in Canada would drop. The Canadian dollar would tank compared to the U.S. dollar. We would be going through rationing, and we would see days of having the federal government and provincial governments go into emergency management of the economy, because there's no other way in which we could survive without that pipeline. It is just that serious.
And you nailed it. And then they have to make up the increase somewhere. So it would be rail, it would be ship, more dangerous forms of transportation to try to make up for that loss. But it's one of these things, like, it's gone on. You've been sounding the alarm on this for, I believe, a few months, but the mainstream media didn't say anything. I've just got whiff of it towards the end of here. How are we not aware of these things? Is it because our leaders aren't making the priority to make us aware of them?
Well, I'm not sure if it's the media that's mad at me because I keep talking gasoline and affordability, as I have for 25 years. But I can tell you that media that I've worked with for many years, one by one, as they've been taken over by younger, less experienced folks who are heavily invested in green and see gasoline, diesel, and oil and natural gas as dirty, refuse to acknowledge these things. So let me put in perspective. Prior to my job here as president for Canadians Affordable Energy, I spent 5 years helping out Gas Buddy. A lot of my work was done in the United States. One of the things we used just this week, a great company, is the outage tracker. It lets people know where gas stations have fuel, where they don't have fuel, so you're not driving around on fumes trying to get filled up. That is something that emergency management officials in the United States absolutely need as part of their arsenal in terms of response. And so for that reason, every state would send representatives. We would meet with FEMA, NEMA, NASAO, all these groups every 6 months and talk about how we can better improve this particular app. And for that reason, it wasn't uncommon going back to 2015, 2016, where I would get officials from Great Lakes states. So here I'm talking not just Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, New York, Pennsylvania, all coming to me and saying, you have a problem with Line 5. We have a situation where Michigan is planning to close it down. It's going to hurt us, but it's going to hurt you even more. I spent a considerable amount of my time trying to do this. And I will tell you, I have 3 people I know at the Canadian Press. I'm not going to mention their name, but I said consistently, you've got to look at this. It's going to be a fire bell in the night. It's going to hurt this economy. And all 3 of them, invariably, who I've known for 20, 25 years, my days as a parliamentarian going back to 1993, said, it's a little too political. They've drank the green juice. And that's the problem. Now we have a real problem on our hand. The one's about to smack us right in the backside in the way it happened to the Colonial Pipeline, which is only temporary. That's 6 days.
Yep.
Imagine what happens if this is permanent and shut down in less than 6 days or 6 months.
I just want to show a video here of what you're talking about. Oh, this isn't the one. North Carolina is running through shortages right now. And this is a line up here. I'm just going to flash forward. This is coming to the gas station here. This is just like you said, the Colonial Pipeline was hacked. There's a interruption just for a few days. Can you imagine what a Line 5 closure would do? Gas stations all over North Carolina are out of gas right now. And that's, I mean, you just need to look down to the states right now, what's happening, and amplify that problem by a lot. And that's what we're running into.
Washington, D.C., 88% of gas stations are empty. 88%. So when you lose 1/3 of your energy conduit, that's one thing. But what happens in a circumstance where you're losing 60%, 55% here for all of Eastern Canada? Now, there are alternatives, to be sure. You can bring ships in on the Great Lakes, you can rail and truck, but that's not practical, it's not feasible, and you got to basically displace something else. The bigger issue, of course, is people relying on vessels on the Great Lakes. Except there's one problem. This is permanent. And guess what happens to the Great Lakes and the locks? Anybody in Ontario knows this. From November until March, it's closed. And unless we want to bring back the 1975 hit by Gordon Lightfoot, the Song of the Edmund Fitzgerald, because there's well over 6,000 ships at the bottom of the Great Lakes, I don't think we can afford to have one of those spill any oil. It'd be far more devastating to the Great Lakes than concern about a spot of rust sitting on a pipeline that has never leaked since 1953 across the Straits of Mackinac, and for which the company is willing to spend $500 million to bury the damn thing under and encase it in cement so it will never leak. Right now, it's the strongest, thickest gauge pipeline anywhere in the world. So I don't, there's a number of ways to defend this. I don't speak to the people at Enbridge. I think that they should have done a better job, especially given the Kalamazoo River disaster in 2010. But hey, in 2010, you also had, the BP Horizon, Deep Horizon drill that imploded. And of course, that created not only an economic problem, but obviously a massive environmental spill. So, I think these companies are getting their act together, but to denigrate pipelines that has given us significant wealth and maintain our standard of living and allowed us, our economies, to remain viable between two nations that have the largest trade relationship anywhere in the world, and between two jurisdictions, Michigan and Ontario, which constitute the largest sub-sovereign trade zone anywhere in the world. This is absolutely ridiculous. And I think it's time for green fanatics to pack it in, because let me give some advice to them. For the ones that might be listening here, Greg, you're about to cause a backlash, likes of which will set your ambitions and all the advantages that you've gained over the past 10 years back 20 years. We'll be back to the year 2000, when people truly thought that green folks, especially pushing carbon, pushing climate change, were absolutely bonkers.
Oh, boiling the frog only works if you do it slowly, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, and you're going to turn the heat up that quick. A lot of people are going to jump out and take notice. And I think that's where we're at. But I want to ask one question here. I know you're tight on time. I don't know what your schedule looks like, but if you were prime minister tomorrow, what should our energy plan look like in Canada? I mean, the Energy East pipeline to me seems like that would be real helpful right now if that would have been completed. But what is Mr. McTeague? What does your platform look like for energy if elected?
Yeah, well, I'm sure the people would elect me, but I'm not so sure that the elites would allow it. So let me be really blunt about it. I would say that Energy East has to be the first priority. And I would hope that Aaron O'Toole, if he wants to redeem himself, says, look, the pipeline's there. Let's revive Energy East as far as it goes to Ontario. That way you avoid Quebec's shenanigans. You actually wind up helping them. And at the same time, you create we get one step closer to a cross-country corridor. We shouldn't rely on the Americans, no matter how the geography pans out, to transit our any of our energies, including electricity. It's a wake-up call. It's a warning. And it's really a dress rehearsal for what I think the country has to do. And it also brings into perspective some of the credit we don't get for clean energy. So let's talk electricity. The amount of subsidized electricity we give to Michigan every year. Maybe that should be part of the bargaining, negotiations. We'll see what happens on the 18th of May when Biden is in Michigan and Enbridge and Gretchen Whitmer sit down again for their court mandated powwow or discussion. But I'm not hopeful. I think Canada has to have a plan. And given that the federal government took so long to clue in to this issue until it was almost, final hours, I think maybe it's time to set forth a plan and realize that you're not going to get rid of carbon and fossil fuels. No one thinks that's going to happen. Other countries think it's a joke to go down this road, China and India in particular. But we're only harming ourselves, and we need to have leadership, and we need to have a plan. And the plan involves, whether you like it or not, carbon and fossil fuels. And if we don't like that, well, then, be prepared to surrender the standard of living and perhaps the national unity of this country at the end of the day.
Well, I mean, it's definitely a talk we have the Wild Rose Party out in Alberta talking, and the heat's only getting more increased there. But what can Canadians do? What should we be doing on this topic to drive attention to it? Sometimes I feel like I'm just swinging in the dark and throwing mud at walls and hoping something sticks. But what should we be doing to try to drive attention on this topic?
Well, I think we have to work with the parties that once thought this was an important issue. Western Canadian members of Parliament understand this issue. Anybody from interior British Columbia, all of Alberta, all of Saskatchewan, most of Manitoba, and I would say anything outside of the major urban centers in Toronto or in Ontario, and even I would say, even Quebec City, understand the importance of our resource sector and need to redouble our efforts at protecting that, especially at a vulnerable time in which a real crisis has made our ability to grow almost impossible. We can't all rely on the idea that our home value and real estate in this super bubble that we're going to see is somehow the way out or a substitute for growth in all of our other economic sectors. I think Canadians have to work hard with their members of Parliament and ask some tough questions of their candidates. Are you going to stand up for Canadian resources, or are you going to get caught up in the flavor of the day and stupidity that says that every 10 years we're facing an existential crisis? Now, remember, Greg, I was a member of Parliament in 2008, and I thought the green shift by my party was stupid then, and I still believe it's crazy now. And I say that because it's just more hype than it is practical in reality. And for that reason alone, I think it's time for us to get real and start asking and demanding of our politicians that they put our interests first, our sector, our energy sector, and our manufacturers first, and our jobs first, and our affordability, not just with energy, but for food and everything else. And for God's sakes, let's stop this idea of taxation during a pandemic, in which Mr. Trudeau did twice with carbon taxes.
Oh, absolutely nailed it. Where can we find your work at?
Yeah, please come. Well, if you want the Twitter stuff, it's always gas price wizard. But most importantly, if you are looking at the work that we're trying to do here at Affordable Energy, just go to our site, affordableenergy.ca. And we have a great site that's set up. We're going to try to amend it. We work basically with a lot of volunteers. I put a lot of my own time and effort and what little I can put together to make this thing happen. But my years of experience, I think hopefully will start to break through and remind people. I've always been about trying to help people make ends meet, including the 2 rebates I got for Canadians back in early 2000 on energy. So we're going to try to be consistent, but make no mistake, I think there's a lot more people listening to us today than we've ever seen certainly in the past decade.
Well, I have a feeling that your name is going to become a name that's going to be heard quite a bit in the next few months, unfortunately, as things unfold.
That may be a good or a bad thing, Greg, but
yeah.
I couldn't do it without, your effort here. And I'm really happy to be on Diverge Media with yourself.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for giving us your time. Everybody, Dan McTeague of Canadians for Affordable Energy. Thank you.
Great to be here. Thanks, Greg.
All right. So I'm just thrilled that he took the time to come talk with us about affordable energy in Line 5. Mr. McTeague is the premier sought-after expert on affordable energy in Canada. Just really important topic. Line 5, what he's talking about there, he's been talking about. I want to read a little bit more from his blog. But one step closer to the shutdown of Line 5, and Trudeau remains silent. So this was written just yesterday, released by Mr. McTeague. He said the Michigan government imposed deadline has come, and Enbridge, with more courage than our federal government, has said no to shutting down their Line 5 pipeline, despite what Michigan Governor Whitmer demands. What will Governor Whitmer do now? She has threatened to seize company profits. In an age of interventionist government action, who knows? Maybe she will try. The two sides are supposed to be in mediation and are next scheduled to meet on May 18th. Until then, we appear to be witnessing something of a standoff. But in the midst of this standoff, we have a real crisis unfolding. The consequences of a cyber terrorist attack on another major pipeline, the Colonial Pipeline, throughout the U.S. Eastern Seaboard. And the Colonial Pipeline is a dress rehearsal for what could happen if Line 5 is shut down, as Mr. McTeague talked about. Meanwhile, the governments of Canada and the U.S., because of willful blindness or ideological zeal, are ignoring these lessons of a pipeline shutdown. Two national governments refuse to step in and to try to avoid a second pipeline shutdown. Instead, they advance their radical green agendas, throwing billions of dollars in Canada and trillions in the U.S. at absurd green projects. A real energy infrastructure problem that affects the lives of millions is not enough to prompt them to try to avoid such a crisis. So why don't they work together? Instead, the Trudeau government waited to the 11th hour. And the reality is, Mr. McTeague says we have a bunch of green ideologues in power. They don't want a hydrocarbon energy industry. They don't want any pipelines. They don't want a successful industrial society. We have all, as citizens, reached a level of comfort that we have lost sight of the fact that so many of the benefits of day-to-day society are contingent on some fundamental things working well. One of those would be energy, oil sands here in Canada. One of the most fundamental is reliable, affordable energy infrastructure. And there's no more reliable, affordable energy infrastructure than pipelines. That is why the environmentalists target pipelines. So it's Dan McTeague of Canadians for Affordable Energy, his blog there. But again, this pipeline, if it gets shut down, is over 50% of our oil here. You're talking major shortages, not being able to get the groceries to the grocery stores and things like that. Major issues. And I just want to show this one more time for everyone. Kind of dismissing this. We're very asleep at the wheel right now with the crisis of COVID going on. Everybody's not paying attention to maybe some of the debt that's occurred and issues like the Line 5. But again, this is North Carolina. They had the Colonial Pipeline was hacked and was down for a few days. And this is the lineups outside there. Mr. McTeague was saying Washington State or Washington, D.C. is 88% of the gas stations there are without gas. And so here we are in North Carolina. It's not a light issue, but it is something we need to consider, and it's something that needs to be looked at. So let's go through the comments here, and now that I got a chance to look back. Well, yeah, I would agree with that. We need to draw from the United Nations agreements for sure. Move on to the one spot here in net zero. Wanted to bring this up because I thought it was good here. But Mr. McTeague said, we have politicians and business leaders saying the sky is falling. We have to act now. Time is running out, or our future depends on it. But people have been using this kind of rhetoric about the environment for decades, and yet by virtually every environmental measure, things are getting better. But no matter, net zero by 2050 is the latest version of the environmental scare tactic of forcing consumers to accept things like Trudeau's carbon taxes or green energy plans or other policy madness that really means expanding government control, enriching special interest, and hurting consumers. So Mr. McTeague was a member of Parliament for 18 years, has been fighting adamantly for consumer rights on these issues to make gas pricing known. It's just been at the forefront of this, and he's been sounding the alarm on the Line 5 for quite a while. And you heard him in our interview say that he'd reach out to 3 members of the Canadian press, basically said they didn't want to touch this story because it's too political. So that being said, we're going to close out here today. Again, thank you to Mr. McTeague of Canadians for Affordable Energy for joining us. But knowing that this message is not going to get out through mainstream media outlets, I ask that our audience that has given Mr. McTeague such a warm reception would take the time to share this information out so that other Canadians can be informed about what's going on with Line 5 and affordable energy in Canada. Thank you, everybody, for joining Diverge Media in our interview with Dan McTeague of Canadians for Affordable Energy. We'll see you next time.